So I often get asked the question, do I need to have shooting strings? Well, no. That's a wrap, everybody. Good video. Only kidding. There's far more to it. And we need to take the next steps of breaking that down and really understanding what's happening during a lacrosse shot. Now, although I had my challenges, I was able to attach a camera to the lacrosse bot so that we could see what was happening to a lacrosse ball heading through a lacrosse head during a lacrosse shot. And we'll talk through it in more detail shortly. So to start with, I want to cover off the terminology that I use. It's just so that you don't get to a stage of me explaining something and you're thinking, what the heck is he talking about? When I talk about pocket, I talk about two different types of pocket. There is the normal cradling pocket, and in this particular head, that's set up as a mid pocket, then there is a low pocket, and then there will be a high pocket. But they are all what I refer to as cradling pockets. And the second pocket I talk about is the pre-release pocket. And that's one that not a lot of people talk about. But as you watch the rest of the video, you'll see why it's important that we talk about these things separately from each other. Now, the pre-release pocket is when the ball goes from the cradling pocket to this position. And as you'll see via the video, it holds there for a fraction of a second before it actually releases. Now that we've got all of that covered, let's take a better look of what's actually happening during a lacrosse shot. It starts initially with the ball settling into the cradling pocket. And then from there, it starts to advance through very quickly into the release pocket, where the shooting strings start to come into play, effectively wrapping around the ball and offering more resistance. It then moves into a position where the stringing is fighting the power of centrifugal force, and then it can no longer hold onto the ball as it is released towards the target. Now, the first time I watched this type of video, my mind was blown. And the reason for it is that my understanding of what a shooting string did was it acted more like a speed bump would to a car, or a ripple strip. It offers a little bit of resistance, slowing the ball down as it goes along, almost in like a jumping kind of motion. But as we can see from the video, that's not the case. As the lacrosse head is moving through at a fast pace and our ball is in the release pocket, it sits just in and under that shooting string. With centrifugal force pulling on it in this direction, it then has the shooting string wrapping around the ball. If I take a ball and I place a string across the top of it, I then apply pressure to that string, you can feel the resistance in it. That's what's happening to a lacrosse ball when it impacts a shooting string. Is I no longer think of it like a speed bump or a ripple strip for a car. I think of it more like a miniature clamp that's holding onto the ball ever so slightly and ever so quickly just as it's going through the release pocket. So now that we know exactly what is happening during a lacrosse shot, we're going to compare the difference between this one shooting string versus this, the same head without the shooting strings. Once we've done both tests, we can compare the data and then be able to determine what difference does a shooting string make in a lacrosse head. So the head without the shooter comes in with a really nice predictability in that passing range from 30 to 40 miles per hour. As we start to ramp up to 50 miles per hour, it then starts to have a little less whip in it and is quite smooth in its transition from 50 to 60 miles an hour at 6.2 degrees of whip, then to 2 degrees of whip, and then it tops out at 72 miles per hour. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that head. For the right player, that's a gamer. Now, if we compare that to the same head except with a single shooting string, we can start to see a few small differences. Starting at the lower speeds again, that 30 to 40 mile per hour range, it's a slight increase, but not a lot. At this point, the shooters don't come into play that much. There's just not enough centrifugal force created in that release area to make any real difference. When we start jumping up to the 50 mile an hour range, we can see that there's a couple of degrees more whip. as 50 miles an hour starts to increase more centrifugal force, allowing that shooting string to have a little bit more hold. Once we start to jump into the 60 mile per hour range, there's in fact very little difference between that and the one with no shooter. And once we hit 70 miles per hour, you can see that shooting string starts to clamp onto the ball and it creates a little bit more hold. And then it tops out at 77 miles per hour before it throws out of the top of the head and we lose controllable influence on the ball. Now, if I was to summarize these results, I would say that in the lower passing ranges, there isn't a significant difference. It's only when we start getting up into the faster shooting ranges do we see that clamping effect taking place and offering some sort of differentiation between the two stringings. Now that works out to be around about a 6% difference at the top end. And you might be thinking, does that make a difference? Yes. When we're dealing with setting up elite players, we're often dealing with a tolerance of less than 1%. After all, that's the difference between a ball that hits the crossbar or one that just sneaks in the top corner. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, that's the result with one shooter. What if I put two in? Does that make a significant difference? And what we're going to do is we're going to put this head in with two stacked shooting strings. And let's give it a go and see what the result is. So let's take a look. Starting at 30 miles an hour, we have 16 degrees of whip. That's slightly more than what its counterpart of the single shooting string had. As we increase the speeds to 40 miles per hour and 50 miles per hour, we actually increase whip even more. Now, why that's happening, as we're getting the ball pushing up with more force because we have more speed, it's activating and slightly grabbing on that second shooting string. In other words, it's creating more of a clamp effect at the lower speeds. When we start looking at 60 miles per hour, we actually have a slight bit more whip in comparison to the single shooting string. And as we hit 70 miles an hour, we're actually about the same. And interestingly, its top speed, before we start to lose control, is exactly the same as its single string counterpart. So if I'm to summarize, what's the difference between a single shooting string or if we have stacked shooters like this? I would say that it has more whip at the lower passing ends, but it's about the same at the higher end. And of course I can't leave it there. I've got to test two shooting strings with a row of diamonds in between as a gap. It's one of the most common in lacrosse. So let's see what the results are. And the results tell an interesting story. Starting at the lower end, around 30 miles per hour, we get around about 4 degrees or so more whip. When we go to 40 miles per hour, it's about the same compared to the single string version. At 50 miles per hour, we get a little bit more of a difference with around about a 5.5 degree difference in whip. And at 60 miles per hour, we're about 3.5 degrees more whip compared to a single string. And at 70, we see the same result with two shooting strings versus one. But interestingly from there, the top out speed is 80 miles per hour. 3 miles per hour difference compared to its single string counterpart. Two shooting strings with a row of diamonds in between gives us even more whip right through the range, with around about a 4% difference overall. It's a good result. And now we have to have a conversation about tension. What's that? Oh, string tension. We have to have a conversation about string tension. All right. So to see what difference tension makes in a shooting string, I conducted the following test. I took a head with one shooting string and put it at what I consider its maximum depth. That maximum depth is achieved by loosening the string right off and pushing the ball as far as I can into the release pocket. From that point, I then tighten it, and what you'll find is you end up with a gap that's around about that. You can kind of put your finger through it. And from that point, I then shortened that knot by 1/4 inch at a time. So let's take a look at the results. Now I apologise for how much detail is in this particular graphic, but it's better to see all the results in one go on one page. Starting on the left-hand side, that's with our shooting string at its maximum depth of 4.25 inches. There's a real consistency to the results, with the bottom end passing being incremental with each speed, and as you get into the faster shooting ranges, there's a real predictability. It's kind of the feel you want. When we start to go and we tighten it by 1/4 of an inch and we go to a 4-inch depth, we already start to see some changes in results. And in the bottom end, we've got a circumstance where at 30 miles per hour, it has more whip than what it does at 40 and 50 miles per hour. And that's because the shooting string isn't allowing the ball to roll across it as cleanly as what it was when it was put in loose. As we then go to 3 3/4 inches, it has a very similar result down the bottom end, but we start to get some real separation between 60 and 70 miles per hour. And then once we hit the 3.5 inch mark, well, that's a total disaster, where all of a sudden we've built somewhat of a shelf in that pre-release pocket. And what's happening here is that the shelf we've built is so severe that the ball can't overcome it. You've effectively created a shovel. Maybe we should actually put a shovel in no? Okay. The hard no? Okay. So the data's pretty clear on that one. The moment you start tightening shooting strings, they just don't work to their full potential. And you'll find that consistency throughout the range is affected. So I suggest you leave them as loose as you can. If you need more whip, then you add a second shooting string. If you still need more whip, well, it's time to stop and then go back and revisit your pocket structure. So that sees us done with shooting strings. Until next time, stay well and play well. Seriously, if I get this and I bend it, we can make a shovel and I could put it in. No? Still a hard no.